I'm really skeptical that EVs are the future. I've never quite understood it. All the different critical minerals that go into the batteries and things like that, you're basically trading dependence on one commodity, oil, for 20 or 30 different commodities, which are actually more scarce than oil. Like they bet big on this thing, and I think it is the fad of the moment. But I have my doubts that 10 years from now, we're going to be thinking about EVs as the heart of the auto industry.
Hello, everyone. I'm John Fowler, CEO and co-founder of International Intrigue, former diplomat in Beijing and Shanghai. With me this week, as last week and as the week before, is Jacob Shapiro. He's the director of Geopolitical Analysis at Cognitive Investments. Now, Jacob, you're in New Orleans, and I've been watching a lot of James Carville popping up on media all over the country about the election. Now, my question to you is everyone in your town as absolutely indecipherable when they speak as James Carville?
Coming from an Australian, that's pretty rich. But no, James Carville is certainly a special dialect that you have to do some preparation in order to understand.
Does he ham it up, or is that actually his accent? It's incredible.
Oh no, that's actually how he talks for sure. And there is certainly a class of older gentlemen in Louisiana in the upper classes who talk like that for sure.
I love it. I got to say, American regional accents are disappearing, and it's very sad. But I digress. We've got a big show this week. We're going to talk about Telegram. The CEO got arrested in France this week. I'm sure folks have heard about that, but we've got some takes for you. We're going to talk a little bit about China. Two stories on China. One is about Canada's tariffs on EVs, and then we're going to talk about the Chinese economy more generally. And we're going to wrap up by having a chat about something that I know that is always dear to your heart, Jacob, and that's oil, and specifically some developments in Libya around their oil production. And stick with us because we've got a new game lifted directly from Pardon the Interruption, Jacob and my favorite sports show. We're going to do big deal, little deal. We're going to talk about some things and decide whether they matter or they don't. Let's get stuck in, Jacob.
Yeah, so let's get started with the Telegram story. And I have to watch myself, John, because I could talk about this for the entire episode. So what's happened is that French authorities arrested the Russian-born CEO of Telegram. Telegram, if you don't know, if you're older and you're not happening these days, it's a messaging app. It's something like WhatsApp or something like that you would use. He had just flown into France on his private jet from Azerbaijan. What a nice life! And the French authorities picked him up. Telegram is actually based in the UAE, where Durov has citizenship. He now has citizenship in the UAE and in France because he fled Russia in 2014, precisely because the Russian government asked him to hand over data on users of a Russian Facebook sort of app that he developed inside of Russia. And he said freedom of speech was more important than that, and he decided to leave his own country. I bring that up because it sounds like what happened here, at least according to Politico, quoting an anonymous French justice official, was that French authorities were frustrated with Telegram because they were asking for materials related to a child sexual abuse case, and Telegram was not handing them over. And that's why they've brought Durov in and are accusing him of being complicit in the things that are happening on his messaging app. Now, Telegram has said that it abides by all EU laws, that it's absurd to hold the owner of the platform culpable for the things that happen on the platform itself. I am sort of sympathetic to that argument in broad scopes. It's also interesting to note French President Emmanuel Macron insists that this is not political, that this is happening within a judicial legal framework. Politico also reported Macron's been using Telegram since its early days, and that a lot of his top cabinet members and officials use Telegram, and that Macron himself uses Telegram. So that's sort of an interesting thing there. And I also saw a really interesting quote from Russia's former president. Now he's the deputy head of the Security Council, Dmitry Medvedev, which talked about how Durov had miscalculated by leaving the motherland. That of course he was going to get picked up by foreign authorities eventually, and that he should realize that he can't choose one's own good over the motherland or over the fatherland. So there's a lot here to unpack, John. I'll let you point the direction, and maybe we can try and break this apart a little bit.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that quote from Medvedev because there's something in that. I think I do wonder if he was Indian or if he was some other nationality. And to be clear, he's many nationalities now. I think he's got UAE citizenship and a bunch of others as well. But I do wonder if he was Indian or a country that the West doesn't want to upset whether he would have been arrested. Maybe the French judicial system is, I think, fairly impartial from politics, so perhaps he would have been anyway. But I think this story is just a real Rorschach test. I say that pretty regularly, but you can see in this story whatever you want to. Are you a libertarian on free speech like Elon Musk? Well, then obviously it's governments getting in the way of free speech and it's a disgrace. If you are a geopolitical conspiracy theorist, you see the DGSR and the KGB/FSB doing battle behind the scenes via arresting people. I saw one take saying that, this means that Vladimir Putin will immediately go out and arrest a Western person in Russia because the prisoner exchanges are a long kind of, a well-traveled road for Putin. But I think for me this is a fundamental story. I said it last week about Twitter. It's a fundamental tech social media story in the world. Governments. Social media is a fundamentally global technology. It aggregates power in places that can't be controlled by those governments. In Telegram's case, it's a chaotic app. It has no moderation. It is used, as you said, for child sex exploitation materials. It is clearly the Wild West. That's both a use to the government because they can spy on these things pretty easily. I mean, there's been a lot of misreporting on the technology of Telegram that, it's encrypted end to end. It is, but it isn't. It's very easy for these governments to join group chats and creep on them. So in one sense, it's like very useful for governments, but in another sense, they can't control what's being said and spread on there. And that's a fundamentally destabilizing technology for governments. We said it about Twitter last week. I think these fights are just beginning between governments, social media executives, companies that profess to basically be decentralizing technologies.
Yeah, and you probably saw that letter from Mark Zuckerberg to, I believe it was, I can't remember if it was a committee in the Senate or the House, but it was a letter where he was basically saying he was unhappy with how the Biden administration had asked Meta to censor some things on their platform around COVID, and that he wasn't going to be participating in the next election cycle to help because he was getting ascribed all sorts of political views that he didn't have, that he helped participate in some of that last time because he was trying to be a neutral force to get rid of disinformation. And I guess he didn't feel like he got feted enough for that. But yeah, I do think there's a lot. I think there's a lot to say about the clash between government and tech companies there, and I do think that's going to be an ongoing thing. I actually think you put your finger on the key of this, which is, I have friends who work in, like, Facebook and Meta have entire departments that just take down disinformation and that work with governments to understand what's disinformation, what's not, what's sensitive, what's not. That's true of all these different tech companies. I don't know anybody that works at Telegram. My sense is they don't have that. My sense is that it really is just an open messaging platform. So in that sense, maybe it doesn't tell us a whole lot about all of these different tech companies because it is a unique one. At the same time, like, it's not hard to go from, okay, if they're going to do this to Pavel Durov, do tech CEOs need to worry when they travel to different countries that they're going to get arrested for some of these crimes? I was actually reading a really interesting story in the New Yorker where French authorities tried to arrest this American couple because somehow they had acquired some gold bars that it turned out had been a part of a shipwreck, and that was against French law. And so they ruined these people's lives for 2 years because they were trying to get the gold bars back from the shipwreck. Just imagine if you're an employee or an executive at one of these tech companies and you get on the wrong side here. And the other thing is, I have this reflexive sort of Christopher Hitchensy, want to defend freedom of speech backbone too, where it's like you cannot convict Pavel Durov of thought crimes. And he's actually the exact type of ally you want in the West. He's a Russian who ran away from this sort of thing. And it's terrible that he's now getting picked up because people are doing terrible things with his platform that, yes, I'm sure all types of shady people connect. It also means that maybe Iranian dissidents could connect with people outside of the country, or that other dissidents who are, at risk of their own governments could connect too. So there's also a good side to these things, and throwing the baby out with the bathwater seems weird. But at the same time, that puts me on the side of not handing over the information on the sexual abuse crimes to the French authorities, which I'm obviously not. So it's really hard, I think, to get to ground truth here.
Yeah, you make a great point about Telegram vis-a-vis Meta. I read a story somewhere that Meta and Google, I suppose, have 30 to 40,000 folks working in their trust, misinformation, disinformation kind of teams. Telegram's whole team, CEO to receptionist, is 50 people. So they simply can't be doing moderation, and they don't have the technical capability or the power to do that. So, and that's a feature and a bug, right? They can say, listen, you can be sure we're not moderating what you say on here because we don't have the ability to do so. But then when governments reach out and say, hey, we've got a problem, and I think it's very useful to use these edge cases as thought experiments. There is nobody on the planet worth talking to who thinks that child sex exploitation material is part of freedom of speech. It is a very clear case. So when you put that to people like Elon Musk, to libertarians, I agree, I share that reflexive freedom of speech kind of position. When you put these very easy thought experiment cases to them, it becomes a very difficult question. We do need moderation on these platforms, but I don't think that governments should be arresting people when things happen on those platforms that are, outside their control. Last thing on this, I saw an analogy being made, and, I'm always wary about arguing by analogy, but an analogy made to the inventor of the telephone. Now, it would be absurd to hold Alexander Graham Bell liable for criminal acts conducted via a telephone call, but also telephone companies have long cooperated with governments on those edge cases. And when you have social media companies and powerful CEOs resisting even the most benign moderation of these things, you get into these areas where I don't think there is an answer, but we're going to see these conversations play out very publicly.
Well, and just to close it, I mean, that's why if what happened here was the French were investigating a crime and they asked for information and they presented all the legal documentation that they needed in order to get access to this information, and Telegram didn't give it, that's an open and shut case. Like here in the United States, like if you can show like evidence, you can subpoena records like that if you can show that you have probable cause or all those other sorts of things. So if that's all that it was, okay, like, yeah, it's an interesting window into a lot of what ifs, but it's a fairly open and shut case. But it's hard to think that's just what this is about, considering who this guy is, where he's from. Was it one case? Was it many? We don't have a lot of information. Macron is out there tweeting too. So like you put it all together, it's really hard to, it's hard to get there, and it opens up those other doors. And I would actually push back against what you said. I don't think government should moderate anything. There should be legal framework so that if you can prove something, you can get those records, as I talked about. But the moment that the government gets in the business of moderating anything, I'm not for it. People are, as far as I'm concerned, post all the illegal, demented, horrible stuff that you want. That's great. Then I know how to find you, and the authorities know how to find you, and we can get rid of you. Like, I'm all for posting that stuff.
We could talk about this for half an hour, I can tell, because I've got takes and you've got takes, but we must move on. And we'll be talking about Canada putting tariffs on Chinese EVs. There's no segue from talking about Telegram to that. But the news here is that Prime Minister Justin Trudeau on Monday announced tariffs of 100% on China-made electric vehicles and 25% on steel and aluminium. Note how I pronounced that correctly.
I was hoping you were going to pronounce it correctly.
This comes on the back of Joe Biden back in May announcing very similar tariffs, 100% on electric vehicles, 50% on solar cells, semiconductors, and 25% on lithium-ion batteries and other goods, including steel and stuff like that. And the EU has also imposed tariffs of a bit less, but up to 36.3% on Chinese EVs in a very complicated tariff schedule. Justin Trudeau said China is not playing by the same rules, and Canada is going to be acting in parallel with other economies to redress this. And he basically said that we're countering China's intentional state-directed policy of overcapacity and flooding foreign markets in these kinds of critical industries. I think Germany has also reacted to this, saying that it's clearly a policy of China to flood markets, and we need to react to it. And actually, I was in Chicago last week and had a conversation with Congressman Raja Krishnamurti, who's on the House Select Committee for China policy, and he said exactly the same thing, that this is the economic playbook of China, and we need to push back. Now, there is clearly coordinated narrative building going on here, Jacob. There's policies directed at kind of pushing back on this narrative that China floods foreign markets, unfair economic and trade practices. Do you think that's fair? Or do you think these are kind of cynical explanations from foreign leaders, Trudeau, Biden, and others, who clearly their economies have missed the boat on EVs, on these kinds of industries? And do you think it's cynical that they're kind of saying, oh, we're using this as an excuse to actually give us time to build up our manufacturing capability?
Well, first of all, John, if you've ever met a non-cynical politician, I'd like to be introduced. So I think obviously they're all going to be cynical.
Don't ruin my my idealism here, Jacob.
Oh, okay. Well, I have four points that I'll try to make really succinctly. The first, I think, has to do more with Canada and the US than anything else. I think that maybe the Canadian government is trying to get ahead of a second Trump administration. So not just putting some protectionist measures in place on China, but trying to signal to the US government, hey, we're with you on China. We don't want there to be any distance between us, because there was the first time around with Trump and Trudeau. And I think it caused a lot of friction between the two. The second is, look, China bet big on electric vehicles. Um, and Chinese companies are suffering from it. There were 500 Chinese EV makers in 2019. There are about 100 right now. We used to talk about Chinese ghost cities. I saw this incredible photo article from Bloomberg that was just hundreds of EVs in cities like Hangzhou just sitting with trees growing in them and moss growing in them because they've made too many of them. And that's exactly what China does. It goes at something and it builds a huge capacity, and it drives down the price of these things. The reason that everybody's driving Teslas around, even in New Orleans with all the potholes and everything, is because they've had to lower the price because they're getting competition from these Chinese EV makers and from others like that. That's in some ways the way the market's supposed to work. So you're welcome, is what we should be saying to the Chinese, in some sense, if what you want is to drive down the cost of EVs. And that's something that China's going to have to figure out. Nobody's going to match China here. They're producing 6 million EVs already annually. One of 3 cars in the country sold domestically is now an EV. It accounts for 60% of the world's current EV fleet. And that's only going to get bigger because their EV factories are not even close to at capacity. So even if all these countries put aside all of their differences, like, they're not going to compete with China on that
Mm.
level. Um, that sort of goes into the steel aluminum thing, which I also want to make a point about, which is we have cheap steel and aluminum, or aluminium, or however you want to pronounce it, because of China. China in 2 years produces more steel than the British produced in 250 years. That's the level of production that we're
Mm.
talking about here. And does it distort markets? Absolutely. And if you are a steel maker, or if you're an aluminium maker, or if you're in some of these commodity markets, yeah, you've been totally screwed. But if you are buying commodities that have steel in them, that's one of the reasons those commodities have, the price of those things has come down so much. Now, I can make an argument that that leads to inflation, or that it leads to deflation as you try and rationalize that market. But I don't think people accept that one of the reasons things were so good between 2008 and COVID, and things became so cheap, and we didn't talk about inflation for an entire generation, was because China produced these things. And if you are going to go after China, the backside of that is that prices are going to increase. Either that or demand is going to decline, and we're going to get into a sort of a deflationary crisis. Last point, I'm really skeptical that EVs are the future. I've never quite understood it. All the different critical minerals that go into the batteries and things like that, you're basically trading dependence on one commodity, oil, for 20 or 30 different commodities, which are actually more scarce than oil. Cobalt is all being mined by slave labor in the Democratic Republic of Congo. All, I think, what, 70% of it that way, and then it's processed in China. You go down the list of where all these minerals are mined, the environmental cost, how much supply there actually is relative to the demand if everybody had an EV. To me, it just doesn't scale. And that's why I think you've seen automakers like Toyota, like Honda, that are thinking, oh, we're going to downgrade the EVs. We're going to go all in on hybrids, or we're going to invest in hydrogen, or we're going to think about ways that this technology can scale, because it's not clear to me that EVs can work. And that gets back to China betting on the wrong horse. Like, they bet big on this thing, and I think it is the fad of the moment. But I have my doubts that 10 years from now, we're going to be thinking about EVs as the heart of the auto industry.
Yeah, I've heard you say that before. It's interesting. I have no real view on that. I will say anecdotally, when I was back in Australia in April, every third car seemed to be a build your dream, aka BYD, a very big China
Mm.
EV manufacturer. So maybe you're right logically, but it may just happen through pure force of production. EVs may just take over because there's so many of them and people need to drive cars. I don't know. But one other point is that you make a great point about things are going to be more expensive. And the reason they've been cheap is because China has been, able to produce at such incredible capacity. The message from one of the from the congressman to business executives when I was in the room was, you are going to have to accept higher price inputs. Whether they are, it's interesting that that narrative is being pushed by elected officials. I know that when I was a diplomat in China, our government tried to do that more subtly amongst Australian businesses who have long had a over-reliance on China, in my opinion. And I think businesses are accepting that a little bit more, but will consumers? I don't know. I think it's going to be very hard with Amazon kind of mentality of comparing prices for the every last cent. that people are going to be like, well, for the good of the country and the future economic policy of this administration, I'm going to accept higher prices.
Yeah, we have to put a pin in that, but we should come back to it next week because I think it actually dovetails with the next story that we're going to lead into, which was sort of based on the Chinese economy in general. But I think there's a point to be made there about the US in particular and Western economies in general that we should come back to. But sort of segueing from Canada putting tariffs on Chinese EVs into Chinese economic data has not been good this year at all. But there have been some more disturbing signs recently. Investment led growth has really peaked there. China's growth figures, sort of quarter by quarter, they're not hitting their marks where they thought they were going to hit. I think it was 5% is what they thought that they were going to hit. 4.7% was what they admitted to, probably a lot lower. I always go to Rhodium Group when I'm actually trying to see how much China's actually growing versus what they're talking about growing. It was a big week for Chinese stocks because PDD holdings dropped by something like 30 or 40%, which is not that uncommon for Chinese stocks to ping pong back all over the place. It was more the investor call afterwards, where the CEO talked about many new challenges from consumer demand, intensifying competition, and uncertainties in the global environment. If you look at China's consumption in the first half of 2024 compared to previous years, it doesn't look good. We never got the big COVID-19 reopening we were thinking about. And surveys of Chinese people are saying the employment market is grim. People are saving more, not spending more, even though China's cutting interest rates and trying to say, oh, if you get a new refrigerator, you'll get some kind of tax rebate. Like they're trying all sorts of things to try and encourage consumption, and it's not happening. There's also been some reporting in English language media that protest and dissent has been increasing in China. I want to throw a little bit of cold water on that because yes, some groups like the China Dissent Monitor at Freedom House are talking about an increase of 20 to 30% in protests compared to last year. But if I had a nickel for every time somebody was talking about these types of Chinese protests, I wouldn't be on the show with you. I'd be in the South Pacific drinking those little drinks with little umbrellas in them because I'd be fabulously rich. We haven't seen anything like the protests last year when when mortgages were going unpaid. Like that was real and you could feel it in the Chinese economy, and the Chinese government was able to put a lid on it. I think there is a narrative out there that, that maybe is not quite right in terms of dissent, but there's no denying that Chinese economic data is not looking good. I'll let you take it from there, John.
Yeah, just absolutely emphasize what you say about protests. We don't know. I lived there for 5 years and I would go to cities where protests were happening, and sometimes I'd see them, sometimes I wouldn't. Like this stuff is really hard to know with any kind of certainty at scale. So I would completely subscribe to your take on that. I agree with everything you've just said. I want to just zoom out a little bit for folks who don't necessarily understand the Chinese economy in broad strokes. Its consumption generally accounts for about 40% of GDP in China, which is a lot less than more liberal kind of developed Western economies where it can be up to kind of 70% of GDP. The rest of the Chinese economy is made up from property, investment, infrastructure, factories, exports, these kinds of things. We've reported before that property is way down in makeup of GDP. Consumption remains down from an already low kind of makeup in a traditional economy. So that's the fundamental problem with China is if all these things that make up the Chinese overall growth GDP and GDP growth is a political imperative, where does it come from? Well, in a normal economy, again, you might say stimulus, but Xi Jinping has ruled that out specifically because he said it makes Chinese people lazy and welfare addicted, which is an interesting kind of rhetorical flourish from Xi Jinping. He's been
a communist.
Yeah. I know. I was going to say he's been paying attention to the right wing, which is odd. But that's the fundamental problem here in China. And so what are they left to do? Well, we just touched on it in our story about EVs. You export. You export all of this overcapacity that isn't being consumed domestically. And that has some interesting flow-on effects because the countries that you mentioned earlier that for the last 10, 15 years have been delighted to trade with China for cheap goods say now China exports to us, but they don't buy from us. That's not trade. That's not comparative advantage, liberalized trade that everyone thought it was. So that's kind of the dynamic of what we're talking about. And I don't know how China's going to solve this problem. It's interesting you mentioned that Rhodium Group there. I completely agree with you too on that. They're great for this kind of stuff. And Logan Wright, who's the head of their China research team, said China's growth model now is dependent on a more confrontational approach with the rest of the world. So how is that going to play out? Because we know that growth is a political imperative for the Communist Party. It's now dependent on a confrontational approach. And I think that's the direction of things. And just to cap that off, completely differently, but a bit of context. We have Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor, in China right now for an extraordinary trip that is being undercovered, in my view, because he just met with Xi Jinping, which is not something that happens lightly, particularly given his rank. And it produced his talks have produced agreements on military talks at theater command level with the US. So this is a really positive meeting coming on the back of all this negative Chinese economic news. And I think there's an understanding in the Communist Party that they need to kind of pick their battles. And the US is one that they probably want to put on ice for a while they try and muddle through this.
Yeah, China hasn't been pushing the conflict in the last year or two. They're the adults in the room in the South China Sea. They're
Absolutely.
the adults in the room when it comes to the tariffs and things like that, in part because they're the weaker party. They don't have a lot of leverage here. They have asymmetric levers that they can pull, like critical mineral export controls. They announced some of those last week. I think we talked about it. So they can do some things. They can, limit market access for some U.S. companies. But in general, they're the weaker party here. But I just, before we close and get on to the next topic, I just want to say, this is exactly the big question about China, whether their dependence on foreign markets and foreign trade is going to drive them to be aggressive or whether it's going to drive them to compromise. For most of China's history, it didn't have to trade with the rest of the world. It was nice, it would do it a little bit, but they were the center of the universe. They were the middle kingdom. They were where all the barbarians came to give tribute and do all these other sorts of things because they had enough food and they had enough energy and they had it all themselves. That's changed in the last 50 years. They have to import the calories that they eat. They have to import their energy. They're dependent on exports to keep the economy going. Now, we saw this movie with Japan. Japan turned into a Pacific empire that tried to solve that problem by conquering most of East Asia. The question with China is, are they going to be forced into that kind of position 10, 20 years from now if we extrapolate their growth versus their vulnerabilities and weaknesses? Or are they going to be more pragmatic and say, no, we need to work with the United States. We need to work with these greater powers because we don't care about anything outside of Taiwan. We just want you to come. We want the barbarians to come and bring tribute, and we want to be sort of secure in our own borders. I think that's whether you're a China dove or hawk, like that's the fundamental question that you really have to get to. And it's not the question that anybody talks about in the media. It's either World War III or China's collapsing. And hot take, neither one of those scenarios is likely anytime soon.
Right. Let's move on to our last story of this week, and it's Libya. It's an interesting story, and I know that you've got a lot to say on this, so I'll just set it up and let you cook. This is a story about the Benghazi-based administration, and just very quickly, Libya now is kind of divided into two competing groups, governments, authorities that have claim on ruling Libya. One led in Benghazi in the east, led by Khalifa Haftar. And, I'm old enough, Jacob, to remember when Khalifa Haftar was called a warlord in Western media. Now I'm seeing him called the leader of an administration, but I digress. But his administration, I'm just going to call it that for shorthand, has shut down Libya's oil fields in an ongoing battle in the country for control of the government, and especially the central bank, which controls Libya's oil revenue. That's basically how Libya exists, is its oil revenue. Brent crude jumped as much as 3.2% to above $81 a barrel. And I know I asked you a couple of shows ago whether oil would end over $80 by the end of the year. So there's a data point in your favor. Libya sits above Africa's biggest known crude reserve. So we're talking a lot of oil. We're talking meaningful numbers here. And of course, this isn't the last time or the first time it's happened. Libyan oil has been very, very sporadic in port shutdowns and factory problems. There was a UN brokered peace deal designed to kind of prevent this kind of thing from happening, to kind of get these two competing administrations to work together, but it looks like it's potentially going to fall apart. I mean, I think ultimately this country needs oil as its source of income. People have got to pay bribes, people have got to get rich. So oil is how they do that. So I suspect there is a mutual interest in getting oil revenues and oil flowing again. But I guess the question for you is, will they do that, or will politics trump this? And I know this is your specialty, so I'm just going to let you take this where you want.
I don't know about my specialty. First of all, let's all pour one out for Herman Cain. If you're old enough to remember Herman Cain answering questions about Libya when he tried to run for president, if you don't know what I'm talking about, just go Google Herman Cain Libya, and you will thank me. I've gotten a lot of mileage out of that. Look, there's a couple of things here. The first is that I've been surprised Libya has been as stable as it has been for the last year and a half. This is one of those areas where it feels you feel as a geopolitical analyst almost like like you have imposter syndrome. On paper, Libya, it doesn't make sense that Libya is functioning in any meaningful way. There is no Libya anymore. There's been a complete and total breakdown of the political entity that was there before. And yet, your actual oil production's been relatively stable out of Libya for about 12 to 18 months at about 1 million barrels per day. There's been some sort of disruptions here or there, but one of the reasons I think oil has been so low is because people were expecting bigger disruptions out of Libya, and they've been pumping 900,000 to 1 million barrels per day. So I've always sort of been confused at what's going on there. And there, I think we have to say that this is the different factions that are in Libya are being supported by different outside powers. So France had a faction that it was backing. Turkey had a faction that it was backing. The UAE, all these different players were in there. And I think the combination maybe of COVID and the Russia-Ukraine war and some of these other things put those issues on the back burner. And some of those countries maybe didn't want to push their factions in either direction. That's just a guess. I'm trying to figure out why Libya still exists. It does look like oil production, though, is being blocked in a meaningful way. And if this continues for more than a couple weeks, 1 million barrels per day, that's a big deal. Goldman Sachs actually just cut their oil outlook below $80. Great timing for them. Like if Libya is going offline, well, two things there. If Libya is going offline for a couple of weeks and oil doesn't respond more than it has already, then oil prices are going to go in the tank. So that's first. But I would expect you to see a bump in oil prices significantly if Libya stayed up for a long time. The second thing I want to bring up here, though, is if you go back to June, July 2020, so peak pandemic before Russia invaded Ukraine, the biggest story of that summer was when Turkish and French naval assets in the Mediterranean locked on to each other. And Turkey denies this. France says that, Turkish frigates were locking onto French frigates that were trying to impose a weapons blockade around Libya. Turkey was trying to get weapons to its factions, and the French were trying to block them. France suspended its cooperation in a NATO operation in the Mediterranean around this. There was this back and forth between them. We've all forgotten that, I think, since 2020, but that was one of the biggest deals in the world to me because it talks about the fracturing of NATO, the different interests within NATO, Turkey versus Europe, Turkey versus France. Like there's a lot to sort of unpack there. And Libya is one of the places where all of those pressures are coming to a head. So anytime I'm seeing things happen in Libya, I'm trying to read, are the Turks pushing? Are the French pushing? Is somebody else pushing? Is Russia running around? It's hard to figure out exactly what's going on, but that at least you can start to see some of where the puppet strings are going. Last but not least, and this is something I wanted to bring up in general, Turkey has been so quiet this year so far. Like we haven't talked about Turkey hardly at all
Too
since
quiet.
we started doing this podcast or this show. And it's weird. And it's like I'm starting to get weird tingly feelings in the back of my neck about it. I did notice, though, that Abdel Fattah el-Sisi, who is Egypt's dictator, quote unquote president, is traveling to Turkey next week for a visit. They're on the border with Libya. Egypt and Turkey didn't like each other for a long time because Sisi deposed a Muslim Brotherhood democratically elected president, and Erdogan sort of thinks of himself more Muslim Brotherhood oriented than military dictatorship oriented. So interesting timing for Sisi to be going to visit Erdogan right as things are breaking down in Libya and with all the Israeli-Palestinian stuff going on. So I don't have good answers for you. I mean, the answer that I do have for you is if oil stays offline for more than a couple of weeks in Libya, like that's a meaningful market indicator that we need to watch. But as for what's happening in Libya itself, I don't know. I just know that there's enough happening in the background there that we should be watching very carefully because it'll tell us about great power competition in the Mediterranean in a meaningful way.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more. When I don't understand something, which is more than I would like to admit, but it's particularly true on this and on oil prices in general, I try to go back to kind of just first principles about understanding anything. And so much of the chat about oil this year is related to hypotheticals around, Israel, Gaza, what Saudi might do, Iran, like theoretical things about future production. This thing is barrels off the market, actual, tangible, physical. The oil is not being produced. And I think that's why it's different than the other stories we've been talking about this year about oil. And I agree with you. If it stays offline, you will see a bump. And if you don't, that's almost more worrying, right? Because something is fundamentally broken or I don't understand what I'm talking about even more than I know I don't understand what I'm talking about.
Well, it means that maybe Chinese deflation and Chinese lack of consumer demand is also going to get exported to the market rather than the exuberance of the US consumer that has been powering the global economy for the entire year.
Well, let's end on something more fun. I mean, maybe it's not more fun, but at least a game, Jacob, a palate cleanser. We're going to do big deal, little deal. As I said in the intro, we're lifting this directly from one of our favorite sports shows, pardon the interruption. And I will ask you and you'll ask me very quickly about something going on, and we'll decide whether it's a big deal or little deal.
Cool.
Okay, Israel is continuing its raids in the West Bank. It's day 2 of those raids. Palestinian militants overnight confirmed the death of one of their commanders. And the death toll now, I think the latest reports, it's around 17. So this is the West Bank, not Gaza. Jacob, is this raid, is this development a big deal, a little deal, or no deal?
It's funny, you know, we've gotten some comments both on the YouTube channel and me on social media saying that I'm showing my bias on this. And I actually don't think I'm showing my bias. I really just don't know what on earth the Israeli defense establishment is thinking or doing. It makes absolutely no sense to me. So if that's bias, you know, I guess you can, you know, guilty as charged. But I'm not saying whether things are right or wrong. I'm just saying this doesn't make sense because you're opening up yet another front. Like, you've already got Hezbollah and Lebanon cooking. Like, Gaza's not done yet. You're still dealing with things in Gaza. Now you're going to go after the West Bank, which has been relatively quiet in all of this. So I think if it's just the West Bank, it's a little deal. But when we zoom out and now we say we've got active Israeli military operations on 3 different fronts, and that's not counting, you know, the assassinations in Iran or some of the other things that they've been doing. That's a big deal, and for me, it's a big deal in part because I think Israel is massively miscalculating. Maybe I'll be proven wrong about that, but I just don't get it. And John, I know you said 2 for 1, but I'm going to steal one from you and throw you a curveball here. And this was something that was in the Intrigue newsletter, which I love. You guys should check out if you're not checking it out. But Honduras is going to get rid of an extradition treaty that it signed with the United States. I think this is particularly interesting because the United States convicted the former president of Honduras, Juan Orlando Hernandez, for weapons trafficking and drug trafficking. So it's not quite surprising to me that Honduras is saying, "Oh, well, we're not going to like extradite our future presidents to the United States." But to me, there's some concerning things about U.S. influence in Central America in general. Maybe another country now falling away from U.S. interests. Big deal, little deal, no deal.
The geopolitical analyst in me always wants to hedge and say all 3 at once, but that's not what the show is. I will take little deal, and I think it's a little deal. It's Honduras. You know, like how can
Sorry,
it be?
Honduran listeners, all 3 of you.
I mean, how can you call that a big deal? I think it's interesting, and I don't think it's no deal at all. The extradition treaty is being ripped up after 100 years, so there's history there. I think it does show the decline of U.S. sway over these kinds of countries. I think it's interesting that a lot of these countries kind of feel like they don't need the US for prosperity because their leaders, who are increasingly authoritarian, probably feel like they have their countries locked down politically without needing to improve the lives of their citizens. And the reason this is being ripped up apparently is because the US ambassador said some things about the Honduran president not or supporting Maduro in Venezuela, obviously the sham election in Venezuela. So this is kind of like a real like handbags at 5 paces kind of thing. And you're ripping up extradition treaties. So that's a little deal that they reacted like this, but yeah, Honduras. We can't be calling Honduras a big deal. Otherwise everything's a big deal.
Handbags at 5 paces. Can you translate that?
That's a saying of like, all sound and fury and signifying not much at all, to quote Shakespeare. The idea that you're just waving handbags at each other, trying to hit each other in the face, but it's not a real conflict.
Learn something new every day.
You're gonna have to catch me on all these Australian phrases I accidentally drop in without even thinking about it.
All right. Well, enjoy your aluminium.
Thanks, Jacob. We'll be back next week. Thanks, everybody.